RandomNet, where we just gonna go through the randomness of this vast internet, and maybe just uh, learn something new, or maybe like goof around for the next hour, and let uh, let the let the flow of the internet guide us, I guess. But to make it even interesting, I created this random net wheel, which you can request if you want. Just leave a comment, and I can just post it or whatever. Because I don't think anyone actually want this, but if you do, this would be a cool game because you can spin this, and wherever it lands, you can maybe have like something around that. So maybe if it's a good reads, I don't know why I'm going there, but if you do have like a party game, then if it lands on Twitter, then you can ask them to tweet something. Likewise on the other platforms, so something on that line. So there's something there, but since we're not partying right now, I'm just gonna click to spin, and wherever we land, we're gonna just go to that platform, and from there, just explore the randomness of within that platform. So without any overdue, I'm gonna click to spin here, and let's see. Goodreads. Okay. Yeah, I kind of was hoping that uh, I'll land on Goodreads because it's fun. I haven't tried this before, and basically similar to what we've been doing on IMDb. We'll just go through various reviews for different books, and I don't know which book I should start with. Wait a second. What will you discover? Uh, this is interesting. So it says nudge. I wish I can expand this, but probably gonna go one book at a time. All right, nudge. Improving decisions about health, wealth, and happiness. Okay. I do like this Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and I wasn't able to finish the entire book. I probably read quarter, and it's a big book, so it will take a while if you're planning to get into it. Kind of curious what's this book about? The nudge. So Anya writes, I don't understand why this is a runaway bestseller. It's just not that enthralling. I've been reading lots of books lately about behavioral psychology and economics. Why people make the decisions we do, economically and in other life areas, but predictably irrational and made to stick. Both explore these questions in a much more engaging way. So we got two other books we can bounce off to. Let me just open it in a new tab. Nudge is mostly concerned with how companies and governments can practice what the authors term libertarian paternalism, gently, non coercively pushing people towards doing something that they really want to do. For example, a company might, by default, enroll new employees in a 401k plan and put a certain salary percentage into that plan. The employees can opt out or change their contribution amount at any time, but by enrolling everyone by default, the company does an end run around its workers' natural procrastination tendencies without forcing them into anything. Another use of nudging, this one on the state level, might be to require that everyone's signing up for a driver's license checkbox saying either, yes, I want to be an organ donor, or no, I don't wish to be an organ donor. Or a state could change its law so that people are, by default, assumed to be willing donors unless they say that they don't want to. This would greatly increase the number of organs available for emergency transplants. So, interesting stuff, but not enough to fuel an entire book. I would I wound up skimming quite a bit, and while some of the anecdotes are funny and interesting, many of the writer's proposals are dry unless you happen to be fascinated by the particular social or economic issue they are addressing. It's worth picking Nudge up to see if it grabs you. Just don't be surprised if it lets go about 100 pages in. Okay, Trevor writes, This one book, this one took me longer to read that is reasonable for a book of its length or the clear style it is written in. I mean, such a simply written text of 250 pages ought to have finished in no time. The problem was that I don't live in the US, and so many of the examples made the book a struggle for me. All the same, there are ideas in this book that are important no matter where you live. Don't you just love the internet? I wanted to start this paragraph with that quote by Goring. When I hear the word culture, I reach for my Luger. But it turns out it is actually a quote from a play by Hans Jost, which is even better. Whenever I hear of culture, I release the safety on my brewing. I have much the same reaction when I hear the word choice. There is a false equality set up between freedom and choice. It is as if the two terms are identical. Since I've had to read through dozens of American examples in this book of why this identity may not always apply, I would like to give an Australian example to explain some of the key concepts of this book. A couple of decades ago, Australian workers went without a national pay increase and rather had this money directed into superannuation. Superannuation is essentially forced saving for retirement. Over the years, this required percentage of an employee's wage dedicated to superannuation has increased so that today it stands at 9%. Everyone knows that if people are to retire on anything like their current salary, they need to put aside around 15% of their lifetime earnings. The gap between 9% and 15% is one that will, for most people, borne by reduced living standards at the end of their lives. The previous Australian government decided that it would be a good idea to introduce choice into the superannuation system. So, whereas previously most people were corralled into mostly industry superannuation funds that were not for profit, meaning they had low fees and profits went back into the fund, the new system opened up the superannuation business to private operators. People would now be able to choose which fund to invest their money in. Where did I put that, Luger? The industry funds obviously didn't like this idea, but like choice, competition is always a good thing and can never be criticized, right? Well, it is not quite so easy. The problem is that the industry funds asked the previous government to structure the new system so that all funds would have to disclose all fees and charges associated with their products. This would clearly have favored the industry funds that often don't charge fees at all. The government refused to include this disclosure of information as a proviso in the legislation. Of course, this made freedom of choice a bit of a joke. You can't really have freedom if your choice is also based on your being free from vital information. What made matters worse was that the financial planning industry in Australia isn't as well regulated as it might be. Financial planners generally receive commissions from the financial institutions whose products they sell. Oh, sorry, encourage you to take up. So, rather than providing you with a plan that is unequivocally in your best interest, the financial planner you are seeing may have, actually will have, a strong motivation to provide you with information that is in their best financial interest rather than yours. Economists would say that despite all of the obvious problems with this new system of choice, it is still better as people always act in their own best interest as rational economic agents. and more choice, even if some of those choices might be biased against people, is always better. The writers of this book define themselves as libertarian paternalists. Essentially, they also believe that choices are good things. However, they acknowledge that choice alone isn't enough and that people aren't always economically rational entities. One of the ideas I found most useful in this book is the idea of choice architecture. They do not believe in taking choices away from people, but they recognize that being presented with a bewildering array of choices is often enough to stop people from making any choice at all. The book opens with a discussion of a school cafeteria and how you can affect the eating habits of kids simply by how you place the food on display. That is, putting healthier food at eye level rather than fatty, sugary food with will nudge kids towards eating more healthy food. This is not a subtle change. This nudge can drastically improve the eating choices made by the kids. The kids still have a choice to eat rubbish, but this simple change nudges them towards eating better. The point is that you simply don't have the option to display the food in a non nudge way. You have to make some choice about how you're going to display the food. So, doesn't it make sense to set up the display so that people are nudged towards eating well rather than badly? Choices don't occur in a vacuum, and one of the lessons of this book is that if we are going to provide choices, we need to think about the consequences of the choice architecture we put in place in which those choices are going to be made. Another of those pieces of choice architecture is going to depend on what is the default choice. This is because people, being people, many of us are going to get bored early on in the decision making process and just go for the default. Therefore, the default should be the choice that is most likely to meet the needs of those required to make the choice. There is a very disturbing discussion of the Part D prescription drug coverage process in the US, in which people who do not make what is an incredibly difficult choice are randomly assigned to a range of default plans that takes the principle of government non intervention to absurd extremes. The other idea that is very strongly pushed in this book is that people are very much loss averse. This is an idea that has been in virtually every book I've read lately, but this book does more than most to explain the consequences of this aversion. Going back to our superannuation example, one of the reasons why people don't increase their superannuation contributions, despite knowing that it would be good for them in the long term, is that it involves them in a perceived loss now. The authors discuss a way of encouraging higher contributions, which they call the pay more later plan. Essentially, people are encouraged to commit to increasing their contributions at the time of their next pay increase. This way, the increase in contributions does not feel like a loss, and the authors show that this way of increasing contributions leads to higher contributions than virtually any other method. I particularly like their solution to the gay marriage issue that is producing so much heat and so little light in society lately. Their answer is for the government to get out of the marriage business altogether, that the government should enable people to have their relationships recognized on the basis of it being a civil union, and that this be open to all couples, irrespective of their sex or the sex of their partner. This civil union would be the legal and social recognition of a couple's partnership. Marriage then would be left up to religious bodies to worry about. If a particular church refuses to marry you because you want to marry someone they don't think you should, well, find yourself another church. Or even better yet, avoid churches altogether. The last part of this book is a defense of the idea of nudges against radical free market types. The sort of people who, like our previous government, think that choice is always good and ill informed choice is even better. The idea that people might be nudged towards donating their organs after they've finished with them, nudging to eat better food or to get better healthcare cover or to slow down when approaching a dangerous intersection all just seem obviously good to me. So this part of the book was preaching to the converted. But then, like Hegel, I don't equate freedom with choice, but with needs and how we understand those needs. I think freedom has less to do with getting to choose and more to do with getting adequate information on the consequences of that choice. This book doesn't go as far as I might along this path, but at least it recognizes that we are human and that we often need help in making decisions that are in our own best interest. If it was up to me, there would not only be no freedom of choice in superannuation, but superannuation would be a tax and would be run by the Australian tax officer. But don't get me started. This would be an even more interesting book if you live in America, given the nature of the examples. But either way, this is still worth a look. Wow, that's been pretty detailed written comment. Uh, all right, let's check out a few other comments, and then I think I want to check out the other books too, especially this one because it has higher ratings, 4.12, versus this one which has 3.97. But also 87,000 people read that book versus oh, this is 117,000 people read this book and reviewed it over four. So seems like a good read. Cool. Let's start with 3 stars. I asked them why, when they persecute men for religion or color, it was seen by the world as oppression, and when they persecute women, it was dismissed as tradition. By Emmer Martin. This book is generally brilliant if you ignore the misogyny. It is a book written by a man about a man's world for men. The hour in the title does not include half the world. The misogyny, the putting down of fat women, ugly ones, old ones, in this often otherwise insightful and percipient book is making me groan. The author is trying to prove something we all know. That is, he uses we and our to sound inclusive, but he only means men really. To not make good decisions when sexually aroused. To that end, he sets up an experiment where the men, MIT students, will have to answer a set of questions sober, and while they are wanking to pictures of buxom young women flashed on their computers. The questions include: would you want to have sex with a really fat woman, an ugly one, a woman over 50, all the undesirable women? All these women are put down as sexual objects these really clever guys wouldn't want to have sex with unless they were so aroused by any stimuli they didn't care. That their general powers of discernment and decision making, that is, we don't screw fat, ugly, or old women, would go by the board because at that stage they'd screw anything. Also, that in such an aroused state, those clever MIT men, future leaders of technology and business, perhaps even footballers, those men might deliberately get a woman drunk and or persist in pushy or downright aggressive sexual advances even after she had said no, and they wouldn't give a monkeys about using a condom either. Part of me wonders how those men felt who had girlfriends who didn't look like supermodels. Personally, I think he wrote up the experiment so he could begin with describing the visual of a cling film, sarin wrapped to Americans, wrapped computer to protect it from splashes of semen, flashing porn and questions, and a man furiously wanking with his left hand while propping up on the bed. Okay, so I'm predictably irrational about books that slag off my half the human race. You know, that I will pick up the misogyny and be compelled to write about it. Well, I got 74 comments. Uh, Sahiba says, very nicely put. Not sure how a writing is released for the world with such a biased sample set. Thanks for the review. Uh, Black Magic Road. I love kittens. I've got one on my lap at the moment. I'm stroking, but it gets a reaction. I'm wearing my black. I don't know what. I mean, I can. I don't have an account, maybe, so I don't want to log in and read through it. But let me just move on to Mary. Uh, by the way, when was this book even released? 2001. Okay. Wait. Wait. What? First published 2008, but uh okay, okay. So this book was released in back in 2008, but George, who's a 2001 Nobel laureate in economics, was praising the author. Okay, so 2008, it's like 14 years back. All right, let's check out what Mary has to say. This book was somewhat entertaining, but I can't really recommend it. The author does experiment with college students and beer and extrapolates this into a worldview. Most of his applications are anecdotal. Here's an example on page 215. Iran is another example of a nation stricken by distrust. An Iranian student at MIT told me that business there lacks a platform of trust. Because of this, no one pays in advance, no one offers credit, and no one is willing to take risk. People must hire within their families where some level of trust exists. Would you like to live in such a world? Excuse me? But I prefer to base my worldview on more than just the impressions of one college student. But this is an example of how he doesn't use logic to come to his conclusions. Here's another tidbit on page 218. Drug companies cheat by sending doctors and their wives off on posh vacations. Using Ariel's logic, this means that all doctors are male, or the women doctors are all lesbians with wives. His experiments on cheating have flaws, since the cheating group scored more than the non cheating group. Uh, the cheating group must have cheated, but they were allowed to destroy their answer sheets. There is no proof that this group cheated. They could have just come from a higher level class or had more coffee. Did you notice how he leads you to the conclusion he wants you to reach? Would an objective researcher characterize one of his subjects as a clever master's student with a charming Indian accent? Wouldn't you be more likely to agree with the conclusion that if the participant was a clever hunchback with an aversion to bathing? He ascribes all kinds of emotion to his subjects throughout the book. It's not that it isn't worth a read. Just realize he's working on your predictability to lead you to his conclusions. Okay, Mary. Well, we meet Trevor again. And this is lengthy comment like his previous comment, but let's check this comment out. Well, it is important that you move this one up your list of books that you have to read. This is a particularly great book. My dear friend Graham recommended I read this book. He has recommended 4 books to me, and the only one I couldn't finish was My Cousin, My Gastroenterologist, a novel by Mark Lear, but he did recommend it. The Tetherballs of Bougainville, also by Layler, and that is still one of the most remarkable books I've ever read. I haven't written a review of that book, but where the hell would I start? Dude is writing his entire thought in here. All right. When I'm reading books, I often think, I would like to rewrite this. I would cut out a lot of the fluff and perhaps change the voice a bit, add some cellos, perhaps even a bassoon. There is nothing that can't be improved with some cellos and bassoon. But not this book. I really, really like this book. Well, you really did. This is a companion to Freakonomics. Except I like this one even more, which reminds me that I must look how many stars I gave that one so that I can give this one more. If I'm going to be irrational, I might as well work at being consistently irrational. All right. Uh, which is the point of this book, economic rationalism, otherwise known as the nonsense that got us into this mess. Holds that the world is full of rational economic units and you are just one of those units. We always know what is good for us. We are free to choose what we need and we invariably make the choices that reflect our best interest. The absurdity of this view is being played out as a type with the world financial markets in meltdown and with the new Prime Minister of Japan saying today, honestly, this for us is beyond our imagination. We have huge fears going ahead, which I believe in is Japanese for the fundamentals are all in place. We have nothing to worry about. Like Freakonomics, this present a series of experiments to show how we behave under various circumstances in ways that are both less than rational and yet perfectly predictable. I'm going to have to spoil bits of this book, but just to show you how wonderful it is and why you need to run to your local purveyor of tantalizing text to obtain your copy of this fine book. I guess one could group a lot of the experiments in this book under the general title of placebo effect. This makes two books in a row in which the placebo effect has been given a starring role, and I am, quite frankly, in seventh heaven. One of the questions this book seeks to answer is whether social stereotypes have an impact on a person's performance. This is the spoiler, so look away if you must. What do we know? Well, we definitely know that all Asians are brilliant at mathematics. This is as true as the fact that anyone with an English accent is a mass murderer. Or at least that is definitely true in that strange world that is American movies and IRA propaganda. The other thing you know about mathematics is that all women are hopelessly, pathetically, mathematically inept. What is it about that Y chromosome? Chromosome. What? You might have noticed that the particular Venn diagram I'm describing here has a rather interesting intersection. That is, women who have a preference for thinking of themselves as Asian. Let's see if we can't mess around with the minds of this particular subset of humanity. We are going to give them a bit of a maths test in a minute. But before we do, let's prime them. Let's ask half of them some questions related to them being Asians. Not too obvious. Let's just ask questions like how many languages do you speak? What is your migrant experience? Vague questions so we aren't directly asking think Asian at them. But actually, when you think about it a little bit, that is exactly what we're doing, okay? The other half, we will ask questions that make them think about themselves being female. When was the last time you bought Cosmo, or are those really in your nails? Anyway, then you give them the math test. And guess what? The Asians who have been primed to think of themselves as women did worse on the test than the women who were primed to think of themselves as Asians. When I hear things like that, a shiver runs down my spine. I know I have learned something incredibly important and something I'm going to have to think about for days and days and weeks. And this book is overflowing with exactly that kind of idea. The sort of thing that makes you go, shit, who would have thought? I mean, which other book have you read lately that asks a MIT student if he would be willing to have sex with a sheep while he is masturbating to images of a naked woman displayed on a Mac laptop covered in clad wrap? Actually, don't answer that. The stuff in this book about stealing and its relationship to money is so interesting. I can only just stop myself not telling you about it. We used to have a president of the Liberal Party. Don't be confused by the name. The liberals here are as far right as the Republicans in the US. Called John Elliott, who basically stole, never tested in court. But then he was rich and politically well connected. 66 million and was released on a technicality. Yet another one of our corporate magnates, Richard Pratt, recently was able to steal 300 mil from the Australian people and only had to repay 36 mil. This time, his crime was tested in court, but he's still seen as some sort of corporate hero here, rather than the thief that he is. How is this possible? Well, this book will help you understand and perhaps even help you see what we can do about these abominations. I love this book. It is a romp, and the guy telling the stories is just the nicest person to be around while he chats away to you. Okay, sometimes I got a little annoyed with the "you'll never guess what happened" style, but this was such a minor criticism I feel petty bringing it up. A large part of what I do in life involves negotiating stuff. Actually, that is also true of you too. It is just that the negotiations I'm involved in are move up front than the ones you probably do day by day. As much as I don't like to admit this book taught me things about negotiating that I ought to have known before. Not since getting to yes have I read a book quite as worthwhile or one that made me rethink stuff I do in quite the same way. I hope to be able to say in 6 months' time that I'm still considering the implications of some of the ideas in this book. If I'm not, then more is a pity for me. You've been told, what the hell are you waiting for? Oh, except you, Tina. You are the only person in the world I wouldn't recommend buy this book. When was your birthday again? Trevor. And he wrote this back in 2008. So, kind of curious how many. Shoot. I was restricted to. Okay, alright. I was hoping we can uh, check out his profile and maybe check out his most recent comment. All right, this one is new. April 25th, 2022. Proved to be irrational, um, in which he challenges readers' assumption about making decisions based on rational thought. Uh, Dude, okay, I wish. I mean, if this was all in English, I would have read it. Hmm. All right, Riku Sayuch says, written in the tried and tested and best selling traditions of the Malcolm Gladwell books and the Freakonomics clones. Dan Ariely's book, too, is an entertaining and counterintuitive look at the world around us. While I'm getting more and more inured to his way of analysis of behavioral economics and psychology, these kinds of books are still hard to resist. That is because they do, no matter if they have now become an industry doling out similar books by the dozens, still stretch our perspectives about the things we normally take for granted or think unworthy of a second thought. In that sense, then, this book was unputdownable and highly instructive. One of my favorite passages from the book is as follows: I suspect that one answer lies in the realm of social norms. As we learned in our experiments, cash will take you only so far. Social norms are the forces that can make a difference in the long run. Instead of focusing the attention of the teachers, parents, and kids on test scores, salaries, and competitions, it might be better to instill in all of us a sense of purpose, mission, and pride in education. To do this, we certainly can't take the patch of market norms. The Beatles proclaimed some time ago that you can't bury me, love. And this also applies to the love of learning. You can't bury it, and if you try, you might chase it away. So how can we improve the educational system? We should probably first rethink school curricula and link them in more obvious ways to social goals: elimination of poverty and crime, elevation of human rights, etc. or technological goals such as boosting energy conservation, space exploration, nanotechnology, etc., and medical goals, which includes cures for cancer, diabetes, obesity, etc., and that we care about as a society. This way, the students, teachers, and parents might see the larger point in education and become more enthusiastic and motivated about it. We should also work hard on making education a goal in itself and stop confusing the number of hours students spend in school with the quality of the education they get. Kids can get excited about many things, like baseball, for example, and it is our challenge as a society to make them want to know as much about Nobel laureates as they now know about baseball players. I'm not suggesting that igniting a social passion of education is simple, but if we succeed in doing so, the value could be immense. So Riku says, this is in the same wavelength as some of my thoughts on education. So that continues. The point is not to have a vocation oriented education system, but rather to have a goal oriented one. I think that the abstractness in what the students want to achieve is a problem arising directly from an abstract education. A system which promotes and encourages students to fix goals in life early and then helps them in moving towards it and rewards them for moving towards it is my vision of utopia in education. There will not be specific courses and subjects being taught in schools and universities, but there will be goal oriented teams formed with advisors for them, and they work together to learn, understand, and develop themselves in any field or knowledge that is required to fulfill their stated goals. All right. Riku says back, I'm hoping to convert this idea on education into a short story or incorporate it into my ongoing novel. So the book helped me crystallize that thought. Sorry for the tangent. Getting back to the book, one more caveat. The author loses the plot a bit in the middle chapters. The beginning chapters about relativity and the power of zero were amusing and fun, and the last two chapters on honesty is amazing, but the chapters in between was a bit of a drag. Despite my mocking tone and slightly negative review, I will hurry to say that it is a very good purchase for anyone who enjoyed Gladwell's books or others of that genre, and also for marketeers and businessmen, and maybe even for policymakers. Despite sugarcoating the book with the requirements of this genre or industry, Dan does raise some poignant questions about human nature and consumer behavior that is worth pondering over. In the final analysis, then, I enjoyed the book and will read it again, and hence 4 stars. Okay. Predictably irrational. What about this book? This has 4.21, which is pretty high rating. And this was published back in 1984. Wow. So 135,000 people have rated with over 4,000 reviewers. So let's check out. Let me do this. The newest first. Let's see. Uh, Let me just filter out based on relevance rather than based on US. But I'm also kind of curious about the oldest, 2007, from Monet Philly. This is simple. Maybe it's a good summary. We have automatic behavior patterns that can be triggered by a single piece of information, and people can hit those triggers and influence our compliance. This book outlines the key triggers: the need to reciprocate, the need to be consistent with our past behavior and beliefs, social proof, or the power of what others are doing. We tend to agree to think more when we like the person. We often obey authority figures against our better judgment. We find opportunities more valuable if they are limited. Okay, let me filter out by popular reviews. Well, okay, that's a big that's a long review, but let's go through it. So Sandeep says, this book can't be summarized. It can only be very, very strongly recommended. Recommended? Yes. But it now buy it now if you haven't read it. Table of contents include weapons of influence, reciprocation, which is the old give and take, commitment and consistency, which is hobgoblins of the mind, social proof, which are truths are us, liking, the friendly thief, authority, directed defense, scarcity, the rule of the few. Notes below are my key takeaways and some important points, but I'm telling you, buy it, read it, trust me. Expensive implies quality. Example, gems in a jewel case that weren't selling were marked up and then sold at a discount to the markup, a price higher than the original price, and they sold like hotcakes. Power of contrast. Example, if you go into a men's store, they'll try and sell you an expensive suit the sell you sell you the expensive sweater because the contrast makes the sweater appear more affordable. Hmm. Reciprocity. If someone buys you something, say a Coke, you're most likely to buy something from them, say raffle tickets. Concession. If someone tries to sell you something and you pass, say $5 of $1 raffle tickets, they'll try and sell you something less that you'll end up buying because you feel bad, like $1 raffle tickets. Uh, Another term used here is reject, then retreat. Commitment leads to consistency, leads to collaboration. Example, during the Korean War, the Chinese got American soldiers to make public commitments of various things. Then they made those commitments even more public when the American soldiers had to stand by to be consistent. That consistency then led them down a path of minor forms of collaboration without them really thinking about it as such. Writing something down, even privately, strengthens your commitment to something. People like and believe in commitment because their image and reputation is on the line. That is the Chinese concentration camp example. Well, people like more what they struggle to get, even if it's not that good. Example, frats. Hey, it's in the book. Don't hate the messenger. People like to feel they have control over a decision, even if they really don't. The power of social proof, or the idea that if others do it, it's good. Example, introverted preschoolers who saw introverted kids become social in a movie were more inclined to go play. Another example, cults. People follow the crowds because they believe in the wisdom of the crowd. Convince and you shall be convinced, like cults, where people who convince or convert others become more convinced. That's why so many are evangelical. Assign responsibility if you want things done. Example, a stabbing that took place over many minutes had 38 witnesses. It happened because everyone figured someone else would call the police. The power of copycats that'll play on social proof. Like if you find a wallet of someone like you and you're more likely to return it. It's true. Another scary example, more suicides when the press publicizes a suicide. More fatal accidents too. Liking is an important part of influence. Attractiveness, similarity in identity and context, compliments, contact, and cooperation all can make someone more influential. The reason good cop, bad cop works is because the subject feels someone is on their side. Associations are powerful. Bearers of good news get treated well, and the bad news get treated poorly. Examples: weathermen or Roman messengers reporting lost battles. People tend to defer to authority or experts. Examples: experiments involving shock therapy, where people listen to a guy in a lab coat to inflict pain on another human being. Incredible how strong this is. The power of connotations and context over content, and how it can imply authority. Titles and clothing do this. Gaining trust. Example: a waiter who advises against a more expensive item early in the meal will gain the trust of everyone at the table, and then he can suggest more expensive items and more items through the course of the meal. Scarcity is powerful. There's a psychological reaction. People don't want to lose their freedom and don't want to lose. This plays to a second point: competition. Invite three used car buyers at the same time and you'll sell the car faster. A cookie is more attractive if there are two of them than if there are 10 of them. Always ask yourself, I guess, when something is scarce, will the cookie taste as good if there are 10 of them? Plus, if you saw that the number went from 10 to 2, you want it even more. It can even lead to revolt. When something is given and then taken away, people get mad. If something is never given at all, they don't know what they are missing. It appears that commitments are most effective in changing a person's self image and future behavior when they are active, public, and effortful. The most influential leaders are those who know how to arrange group conditions to allow the principle of social proof to work maximally in their favor. Social proof is most powerful for those who feel unfamiliar or unsure in a specific situation and who consequently must look outside of themselves for evidence of how to best behave there. Well, that was a long comment, but we got past that. It was a good comment too. It was pretty insightful how he summarized some of the key takeaways from the book. Terry says, I put this book under dangerous knowledge. Cialdini, still a top consultant in this field, has a tiny disclaimer at the end of the book saying how he's aware that this knowledge could be misused, but doesn't go much further. I see this stuff abused all the time to spin democracies to go to war, to sell us products and services we don't really need, and much, much more. I've been wanting to start an ethics institute around this topic. Interested? Write me. Well, Jerry, I hope you did. It's been 14 years, so I'm hoping that your ethics institute is thriving. There's a long comment, so let's review this. Okay. A couple of months ago, I read somewhere that when it comes to the psychology of persuasion and influence, Cialdini's is the daddy of the subject. I chuckle and move on. But then, a few days ago, I found myself in a bookstore holding this book and heading to the counter. I came back home and devoured it chapter by chapter, awestruck and flabbergasted by the sheer brilliance of the psychology of persuasion. Cialdini is no novice. Apart from being an academic scholar and researcher who conducted innumerable experiments over the course of his career, he spent 3 years in field researching for this book. He entered into programs offered by different business enterprises and marketing agencies to train sales staff and dealers in the art of persuasion. Cialdini's explains the science at work behind the curtain of this art show in this book. We live in a consumer society. Our markets survive and thrive on mass consumption of products that are neither necessities nor luxury, but still they find their way to our homes right through our pockets. Why and how it happens? How we are convinced and persuaded to do something we really don't need or want to do. Why, in certain situations, we are unable to fight the temptation to buy something we have no use of. How exactly do we fall for these marketing gimmicks? This book has the answer. For our convenience, our brain has evolved some fixed action patterns, patterns that we follow almost blindly without any resource to reason or logic, or without any recourse to reason or logic. Why we do this? Because our brain has been programmed this way, and because by doing this, we don't have to think too hard. It seems natural and effortless, almost as if it is the most obvious and right thing to do. This shortcut of ours is exploited almost every day by people who are trying to sell us something. Cialdini repeatedly uses the term click where which explains our behavior patterns when we encounter a situation for which we have a programmed reaction. What the situation does is that it appeals to our conscious mind with a red flag signal. A file is clicked open as a result, and we're out rolls the standard sequence of behaviors. For instance, if a thing is expensive, it is good. If a thing is rare, it is precious. Likewise, we are more likely to spend a higher amount on alloy rims if we have spent a fair deal on the car. The more we spend on our suit, the more we are likely to spend on shoes and tie. This is due to the contrast principle, which is that on spending a high amount of money on an expensive thing, we are likely to spend money on something less expensive than the initial product, but which is still expensive enough if compared to its alternatives in the market. Click where. The, the more we spend on the first thing, the more we are likely to spend on the second and the third. The other important principles that marketing agents employ to get our essence are reciprocation, commitment, and consistency, friendliness, authority, and scarcity. These are the shortcuts our brain is evolved to rely upon for making quick, smart decisions. And it is by manipulating these very clickware responses that we are compelled to say yes, even when we don't want or need to. The synthesis of this entire research has been divided and assembled in 7 chapters, each chapter explaining, through case studies, social experiments, research, and psychological analysis of human behavior, different methods, and the tact with which we are convinced to do or not do certain thing. This book has a lot in common with Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which is one of my favorite books of all time. I highly recommend these 2 books to anyone who is interested in behavior psychology. Which takes me to this book, Thinking Fast and Slow. This one has over 400,000 ratings with over 14,000 reviewers. That is uh, gigantic compared to like most of these books. See, 4,000. And still it has like over 4 rating on an average. So that kind of tells you how important or how valuable this book is. We found Trevor here too. All right, Trevor. Look like you read a lot of behavioral economics books. All right, let's start with you. Okay. This is a fascinating book. Reading this book means not having to read so many others. For example, you could avoid having to read Sway, Blink, Nudge, and probably a dozen or so other books on behavioral economics And the best part of it is that this is a guy, or at least one half of the two guys, who came up with these ideas in the first place. I was thinking that perhaps the best way to explain those other books would be to compare them to Monty Python. I want you to imagine something. Say you had spent your entire life and never actually seen an episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus. Yeah, that's me. That wouldn't mean you wouldn't know anything about Monty Python. It is impossible to have lived at any time since the late 60s and not have had some socially dysfunctional male reprise the entire parrot sketch or Spanish Inquisition sketch at you at some stage in your life. I suspect, although there is no way to prove this now, obviously that Osama bin Laden could do the silly walk like a natural. Well, if you had never seen an episode of Monty Python and your entire experience of their work was via the interpretation of men of a certain age down the pub, then finally getting to see an episode of the original would be much the same effect as reading this book. Hundreds of people have already told all these guys' best stories in their own books. But all the same, it is a pleasure to hear them again by the guy that first said, "This parrot is dead," or rather, framing effects make fools of us all. You need to read this book. But what is particularly good about it is that you can come away from it knowing we really are remarkably easy to fool. It's because we think we know stuff that this comes as a constant surprise to us. Years ago, I was talking to a guy who liked to bet. Everyone needs a hobby, and that was his. Anyway, he told me he was playing 2 Up, an Australian betting game, and he realized something like tails hadn't come up frequently enough, and so he started betting on tails, and sure enough, he made money. I told him that coins don't remember the last throw, and so the odds of getting a tail was still 50%, as it had previously been. But I had no credibility. I had already told him I never bet, so how would I possibly know anything if I wasn't even brave enough to put my own money on the outcome? And didn't I understand the point of this story was he had already won? Still, when faced with a series of coin flips that run heads, tails, heads, it does feel like tails are due. This is the sort of mistake we are all too prone to make. The thing to remember is that while there is a law of large numbers, toss a coin often enough, and in the very long run there will be as many heads turn up as tails, that isn't the case in the short run, where just about anything is possible. We, that is, we humans, are remarkably bad at mental statistics. And what makes it worse is that we are predictably bad at statistics. And this brings me to Bourdieu and him saying that sociology is kind of martial art. He means that sociology all allows you to defend yourself from those who would manipulate you. Well, this book is a Bruce Lee book of advanced self defense. Learning just how we fool ourselves might not make you feel terribly great about what it means to be human. But at least you will know why you have stopped up next time you do stuff up. I'm not sure it will stop you stuffing up, but that would be asking for an awful lot from one book. If you want the short version of this book, he has provided the 2 papers that probably got him the Nobel Prize, and they are remarkably clear, easy to understand, and comprehensive. But look, read this book, it will do you good. All right, Trevor. I might have to go back to this book and maybe I'll start from the beginning. But if I remember correctly, it had like over 500 pages or something, so it's gonna take a while. Robert Schneider writes, in the last few years, 2 books took me forever to get through. The first was Daniel Dennett's Darwin's Dangerous Idea, and the second is Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. What caused this? What do they have in common? Both books explain, in minute detail, simple concepts with immensely far reaching implications, and both have been, after the slog, the most intellectually rewarding reading of my adult life. Where to begin? I have a number of theories running around in my head, and occasionally I try to corral them on paper. I organize, sequence, and interconnect them in a way that will prevent my reader from meaningfully widening their eyes in an aside while winding their finger around one ear. Cuckoo. Good writing about complex topics is very, very difficult, and Kahneman has corral- corralled 30 plus years of science, his career, and all he has learned into a perfectly arranged sequence that leads the reader into a wilderness, provisioning you in each chapter with the tools you'll need for the next part of the journey. The second most striking effect on me is the number of times I say, yes, yes, this is what I've been saying. In my case, it has usually been some sort of intuitive, excuse me, Mr. Kahneman, I mean, System 1, recognition of a pattern in my observations about the way we think. In Kahneman's case, those intuitions have been converted into theoretical propositions, each meticulously researched in well designed experiments. Clearly, this is at least one difference between me and a Nobel Prize winning researcher. So, why does this stuff matter? In the context of broader discussions of free will, intention, choice, and control over the directions our lives takes, this book can provide powerful insights that might currently be obscured by these cognitive illusions and the inherent limitations of System 1, System 2 thinking. Perhaps we are not as free in our decisions as we might like to think. If priming has such a stunning reproducible effect, perhaps we are not so determined. If activities that initially require System 2 attention can be turned into second nature, technical expertise institutions, sorry, intuitions? No. Technical expertise intuition, that is, learning and training matters in our ability to detect and respond to events that, if untrained, might take advantage of our brain's inherent blind spots or weaknesses. Perhaps childhood religious indoctrination is a very adept recognition of these mental tendencies or flaws, so profoundly that if intuitively or naively expressed by Ignatius Loyola, founder of the Jesuit order. Give me the boy until 7, I will give you the man. Paraphrased, forgive me. Kahneman's discoveries and documentations of mental capacity and biases could form the basis of a mental martial arts program, an alternative form of indoctrination in which students are trained to understand their brains' weaknesses and learn to take stances or engage in practices that eliminate or reduce the errors to which these weaknesses can lead. This book will rearrange the way you think about how you think. Great. That was a good comment. Well, I'm going to read two more. Let's go through John's comment and then Kara's comment, which are long too. So okay, let's check these two out before we wrap up for the day. All right, so John writes an unrelentingly, relentingly, an unrelentingly tedious book that can be summed up as follows. We are irrationally prone to jump to conclusions based on rule of thumb shortcuts to actual reasoning and in reliance on bad evidence, even though we have the capacity to think our way to better conclusions. But we are lazy, so we don't. We don't understand statistics, and if we did, we'd be more cautious in our judgments and less prone to think highly of our own skill at judging probabilities and outcomes. Life not only is uncertain, we cannot understand it systematically, and luck has just as much to do with what happens to us, maybe even more than we care to admit. When in doubt, rely on an algorithm because it's more accurate than your best guess or some expert's opinion. Above all, determine the baseline before you come to any decisions. If you like endless algebraic word problems and circuitous anecdotes about everything from the author's dead friend Amos to his stint with the Israeli Air Defense Force. If you like slow paced, rambling explanations that rarely summarize a conclusion, if your idea of a hot date is to talk Bayesian theory with a clinical psychologist or an economist, then this book is for you. Who are likely a highly specialized, academically inclined person. Perhaps you are even a blast at parties. I don't know. But if you're like me and you prefer authors to cut to the chase, make their point, and then leave you with a whooping big appendix, if you're interested in the regression analysis of how many freshmen would watch a guy choke to death because they think someone else will come to the rescue, then this book is not for you. If you want to take the Reader's Digest pass through the book, then Chapter 1 and Section 3 are probably the most accessible and can be read in less than an hour and still leave you with a fair understanding of the author's thesis. All right. Okay, John. What about you, Kara? I kind of want to cut this book in half. Praise the first half and stick the second part in some corner to gather dust. Not that the second part is bad, mind you, the entire book is well written and obviously the product of someone who knows their field. There's just a lot of it. Thinking fast and slow is kind of like a guest who shows up to your party and then dazzles everyone with an impromptu 15-minute oration on the geopolitical situation in South Ossetia, and everyone applauds and turns to go back to their own conversations, only for the guests to launch into another story about the time they parachuted into the Balkans to break up a nation civil war, a story which is followed quickly by a similar tale of a visit to Southeast Asia. Well, I think you can catch my drift. Daniel Kahneman spins an interesting tale of human psychology and the way our brains interpret and act on data, but the book overstays its welcome by a few hundred pages. Kahneman's thesis breaks our decision making systems into two pieces, System 1 and 2, which are the respective fast and slow of the title. System 1 provides intuitive judgments based on stimulus we might not even be conscious of receiving. It's a snap signals that we might not even know we are acting upon. System 2 is the more contemplative, cognitively taxing counterpart that we engage for serious mental exertion. Though often oppositional in the types of decisions they produce, Kahneman is keen on emphasize that it's not about system 1 versus system 2. Instead, he's out to educate us about how the interplay between these systems causes us to make decisions that aren't always rational or sensible given the statistics and evidence at hand. Kahneman takes us through an exhaustive tour of biases and fallacies people are prone to making. He talks about the halo effect, affection bias, confirmation bias, and even regression to the mean. As a mathematician, I liked his angle on probability and statistics. As a logician, I appreciate his brief segues into the logical aspects of our contradictory decision making processes. Least I give the impression Kahneman gets too technical. However, I should emphasize that despite its length, thinking fast and slow remains aggressively accessible. There are a few points where, if you don't have a basic grasp of probability, and if Kahneman demonstrates anything, it's that most people don't, then you might feel talked over. Or maybe it's those less than infrequent casual mentions of, and later I won a Nobel Prize. But this book isn't so much about science as it is about people. There are two other things I really appreciated about this book, both of which are related to psychology. I'm a fairly easygoing person and I don't always like to make waves, but sometimes I like to make some trouble and argue with some of my friends about whether psychology is a science. The problem for psychology is that it's actually a rather broad term for a series of overlapping fields of investigations into human behavior. On one end of this continuum, you have Freud and Jung and the various psychoanalysts who, let's face it, are one step up from astrologers and palm readers. On the other end, you have the cutting edge cognitive psychology informed by the neuroscience of MRIs, split brain studies, and rat research. So claiming that psychology is or isn't a science is a little simplistic. And I'm willing to grant that there are areas within psychology that are science. For what it's worth, Kahneman went a long way to reinforcing this. It's clear he and his collaborators have done decades of extensive research. Now, yes, it's social science, but I won't get into that particular snobbery today. The other thing I liked about Thinking Fast and Slow is its failure to mention evolutionary psychology. Once in a while, Kahneman alludes to system one's behavior being the result of evolutionary adaptation, and that's fine because it is true, almost tautologically true. So, but he never quite delves into speculations about why such behavior evolved. And I appreciate this. There's a difference between identifying something as an adaptation and determining why it's an adaptation. And I'm not a fan of evolutionary psychologists attempting to reduce everything to the trauma of trading trees for bipedalism. I'm willing to admit I have an ape brain, but culture must count for something. I suppose it's also worth mentioning that this book reaffirms my supercilious disregard for economics. According to Kahneman, stockbrokers and investors have no idea what they're doing, and some of them know this, but most of them don't. Economists are, for the most part, highly trained, but they seem bent upon sustaining their theoretical fantasy land in which humans are rational creatures. Aristotle aside, the data seem to say it isn't so. I occasionally try my hand at reading books about the economy, just so I can say I did, but they usually end up going over my head. I'm a mathematician, and I don't get numbers, but at least I'm not the only one. So, Thinking Fast and Slow is genuinely interesting. I learned a lot from it. I would rate it higher, but I was starting to flag as I approached the finish line. Truth be told, I skipped the two articles Kahneman included at the end of that were the original publications about the theories he explains in the book. I'm sure they are fascinating for someone with more stamina, but at that point, I just wanted to be done. That's never good. One of the responsibilities of a nonfiction author is to know how to pace a book and keep its length appropriate. Too short and the book is unsatisfying, too long and maybe it's more so. And I think this flaw is entirely avoidable. It's a result of Kahneman's tendency to reiterate, to circle back around to the same discussions over and over again. He spends an entire chapter on prospect theory. Then a few chapters later, he's telling us about its genesis all over again, just from a slightly different angle. Like that party guest, Kahneman is full of interesting stories, but after telling one after another for such a long period of time, it starts sounding like white noise. And he ate all those little cocktail snacks too. I inevitably ended up comparing Thinking Fast and Slow to How We Decide, a much slimmer volume along much the same lines as this one. Whereas Lehrer's focus is on the neurology behind decision making, Kahneman is more interested in the psychology. Both books boil down to we suck at automatic decision making, which statistics are involved. Therefore, we behave less rationally when we believe we do. Lehrer explains why things go wrong, and Kahneman categorizes all the different ways things go wrong. In many ways, the books are complementary, and if this is an area of interest for you, I'll recommend them both. For the casual reader, however, Thinking Fast and Slow is a rather dense meal. By all means, give it a try, but take it slow. Well, thank you, Kara Babcock, for that insightful comment. Well, this is what I love about people in general, on at least online, and on a good platform, because when people have a good intention and or if they're trying to make a good point, they tend to analyze from all different angles. Unlike Twitter or some bite-sized social media where you know they would have to um, post whatever is attractive, you know. So platforms like Goodreads or Reddit are great, where people can expand and are more uh, well-rounded, in my opinion. There might be more platforms which I'm unaware of, but definitely Twitter isn't one of them, and neither is YouTube, uh, or Facebook for that matter. Anyhow, this was great. We we finally were able to go through some good reviews from on Goodreads. I'm hoping that next time when we do this, we land on the Onions, because Onions is a good website, and I can't wait to do that. Well, but until next time, be safe, and do leave a comment on what you found interesting about the reviews we did today, or even if you have like some recommendation of some good psychology books, um, uh, that would be interesting to check out. Well,